Thank you so much for joining us for our second episode of Scene Shift, the podcast. In this episode, we sit down with the brilliant set designer, Marsha Ginsberg, to explore the nuances of design, mentorship in this career, and the power of a space. The conversation with Marsha brought reflection on how our teachers shaped our entry into design and how we model that for others. We marvel over how the smallest details can evolve into the design's biggest impact and dive deeper into our obsessions with spaces. We hope you enjoyed this episode. I'm Maureen Weiss. I'm a performance designer.
I'm Sibyl Wickersheimer. I am a set designer.
And I had the pleasure of working with Sibyl on the book, Scene Shift. This book is about conversations between theatrical designers, specifically scene design.
We have been really interested in continuing our conversations with set designers, discussing where they are now, where they want to go, and what they bring to the practice of set design. We want to continue that practice of talking to each other because it is such a solitary art form.
And finding avenues for connection leads us to continue asking questions about theater, livelihood, and the importance of art in our overwhelming world.
This podcast grew out of that continued interest in conversation and the support of our creative producer, Taya Chura.
Please join us today. So this week, we get to talk to Marsha Ginsberg, who has been an inspiration to both of us for a very long time. I wanted to sort of throw out some things that have been in my brain lately as a designer, which is the idea of what it means to pull focus, especially when you're telling a theater piece. So I think that the brain of Marsha Ginsberg is going to really unpack that in some ways, and also how we sort of pull focus in our careers and the ways that we go and in what direction. So Marsha has an amazing background in both theater, but also started in fine arts and architecture, and she studied at NYU. She has a show on Broadway that we're very excited to talk to her about. And I know that Sibyl has a long background with her.
Yes, so I met you, Marsha, in 1996 when I was studying with Robert Israel, and you were one of our faculty members at UCLA in the graduate program. And then I continued later with the NEA TCG grant, which has been canceled just recently, that was called Career Development Program for Directors and Designers, and they picked 5 directors and 5 designers for a 2-year program. And so it led me to pick artists who are also working as set designers and balancing practices between art and theater design. And so I went straight to Marsha to see if I could assist her in New York, and that program allowed me to live there for a few months assisting you. So I felt like you have influenced me over the years quite a bit, and I always look to see what you're working on, and I'm excited to hear more about where that path has taken you recently. It sounded interesting from our earlier conversation that your path has now led you back to your undergraduate institution, which I did not realize.
No way.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's funny because I did my undergraduate education at Cooper Union in the visual arts program, and it was actually a really interesting time when I was there because it was kind of this moment, post-conceptual art moment, I guess I would call it. But before there was a resurgence of painting, I think a really big influence for me when I was incredibly young, I guess I was just 18 years old. And my first year teacher, we had this foundation program in sculpture, was Hans Hake, who's a really interesting, important conceptual artist. When I was a teenager, I was doing painting and also a lot of photography. And obviously, like most younger people, I had a really limited idea about what the art world was. So this kind of blasted things open. Like we had to read this Lucy Lepard book called 6 Years, The Dematerialization of the Art Object, and John Berger's Ways of Seeing, and this Jack Burnham book, Beyond Modern Sculpture. So it was like all these practices that immediately kind of usurped any idea I had as an 18-year-old. And that was pretty much my education at Cooper. And now I'm teaching in the architecture school. For this semester, I've was given what's called the Feldman Chair, which is an endowed position to have someone work with the architecture students for a semester dealing with space and lighting. So it's really kind of an honor to be there. And it's also like just a great experience to expand my pedagogy with these students.
Is it the first time you've had to teach sort of architectural students as opposed to theatrical design students?
Actually not. Like the interesting thing was that after I taught at UCLA for a chunk of time, and then I came back here to the US and started I was teaching at Wesleyan, and then eventually I was teaching at Parsons School of Design in the architecture program. And it was also like a really happy situation because, as we know, for set design, like I always kind of talk about set design, it's not really like its own pure form, that in order to really understand, there's a kind of foundation, and that foundation can be both in visual arts and also in architecture, because, fundamentally, you have to know about space and have a sensitivity to space, but also have an understanding of how to represent three-dimensional space, either two-dimensionally in drawings or now in digital format, or three-dimensionally in a miniaturized way. So it always was really amazing to work with students who had that foundation, as opposed to, often when one is teaching, that's part of what one has to do. So I've always kind of felt that when I've worked with architecture students, there's just another level that you can get at with the work. So
Because you're so good at it, Marsha, I often wonder, like, when you enter any space, do you notice that there's a first thing you look at?
Yeah, that's it depends on what kind of space. What's also, I guess, interesting is that, I have a background as a photographer, and I think when I first started working in theater, I very much would do things like I would actually go to real spaces and kind of hunt them out and do all this research by actually going someplace. And this sounds kind of hokey, but like when I would be in these spaces, I really was into like the aura of the space. And so it wasn't just its kind of physicality. And sometimes when I'd be photographing these spaces, like I would kind of get, like really into this zone of focus and like kind of hypersensitivity to the space. And so I guess that is something that I feel is a little bit fundamental for me, I would say.
It tracks. One of the things I learned early on was your interest in really looking at an image and really understanding the relationship between the angles of light and the colors, or the position of one couch over, and how much remaining space there would be, or, just the relationship between elements, and that you could then translate that into your design work and look at it and just nudge some one element in order to achieve the balance that you wanted. And so in terms of bringing it full circle, it actually feels like focus and your interest in space and looking at space is very focused from my experience with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that is interesting about it, and I think it also comes from looking at photographs for a long time, like I feel like I've been looking at photographs since I was like, 13 or something like that, like really, studying it. And I had like, even in high school, kind of interesting teachers that really taught me how to look. I'm probably misquoting parts of it, but there's this great like essay or book by Roland Barthes called Camera Lucida. And like one of the things that he tries to understand is like what it is about a photograph that makes us obsessed with it or continues to look at it. And so, he starts to kind of analyze certain images and like finds these little details that are kind of imperfect, actually. Like I'm trying to remember which image it is, but there's some image where there's a portrait and someone has like a Band-Aid on their finger, and he keeps like meditating. And he also connects this act of looking. I mean, a lot of it is about the death of his mother and looking at a photograph obsessively to kind of try to summon up the absence of a person. And you also realize that, that's so much what photography is about, is that it's the kind of artifact of absence in a way. Like it's the manifestation of something that doesn't exist anymore, or the proximity at which it does exist, or that moment doesn't exist anymore. So it's kind of like a recording of the ephemeral in a way. And so that kind of thing really fascinates me, is like the thing when you look at a room or a photograph, the thing that's kind of like off, and that offness of it is the thing that kind of makes it transcendent in a certain way. And I think that, would always, especially in my early work, be something that I was kind of, whether consciously or unconsciously, trying to kind of replicate in these environments.
And those artists we've referenced so far, they all have an interest in seeing at a deeper level of understanding of what that means to each of them.
And also the way that you said that you sort of like, it wasn't the thing that you're looking at, but you were sort of holistically getting a feel for it. And I often wonder about that. As I age, I'm like, I think I just like, somebody could ask me, why are you putting that there? And I'm like, well, I do just know. Like there's just a knowing. Yeah. I probably, when I was younger, I could explain it, but now I don't want anybody to question it, because I do trust that I sort of know these things. And so I appreciate that that's sort of what you were describing more, is like this understanding when you walk in that there is a feeling that is evoked, regardless, of we could say it's, a linear thing, but it is based on a feeling that we've taught ourselves. For even an offness, we know how to make something off.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think it's also like understanding composition as kind of about objects being in tension with each other. And so I think scenographically, I mean, what's interesting scenographically is that we're making a space and we're placing objects and architecture in relation to each other, but then the actors are another element inside that space. And so that's also, I mean, I maybe didn't think about that as much when earlier in my career, and now it is something that I really think a lot about. Part of this is working with really good directors who have innately great compositional senses, so they can kind of pick up on the tensions of a space and know how to place people inside the space. But I kind of feel like it's definitely indescribable, because it's something that you feel when you're making something, and it's definitely like it's for sure why I kind of prefer to make half-inch scale models, because I can feel it in that form, but I can't really feel it if the model is too small, basically. But even like, like dumb things with set, like in English, we had some electrical things like a projector, and I needed to kind of be in the space because the cord that plugs in is part of the composition, actually. Or if there's a conduit on the wall, it's like part of the composition. And like, how do you make these things exist in this tension, but also feel organic, that it's not like this mannered thing where you're staring at the conduit the whole night. Yes. So it's interesting kind of balance, actually.
I love that about your designs too, that it is the cord. I mean, it really, but I'm so glad you said it out loud, because it makes your design so stellar, that you're seeing those things. I'm curious because you started to mention your directors. And so that relationship, like finding those directors and how that symbiotic relationship works for you when you present, I think this is, sort of where I'm going with the set. Do they then say, oh, then I could do this for the most part? Or do you present it and then you just trust that they know how to move around your set?
I think it's very much an organic process. So I really like when designers come to the studio and it's very important for us to just sit and work in the model. And I think that these things for me are very much collaborations like early on. So, Canute, for example, who I did English with, who I have been doing a bunch of shows with. I mean, it's shifted now because we've done so many things together, but a lot of times it begins by like building up a visual vocabulary. And so, we're kind of constantly sharing images with each other, or I'll have something that I'm obsessed with. English began with this kind of mandate from Sanaz that the show be beautiful. And which, was kind of like, I'm like, all right, I'll sign up for that mandate. But I think for her, there's a very specific history about how spaces from the Middle East are represented in American theater. It's this idea of trauma, that the way that we mostly understand a situation in those countries theatrically is it's a play that is about a trauma of a country, a city, a group of characters in that situation. And so there's, I guess the cliche is that it's this kind of bombed out building or something like that. And so, one of the things that she was trying to do with English was to represent characters who are going through very complicated moments, like in terms of like, what does it mean to learn another language, in this case, English, because it obviously implies a need or desire to leave your home country. You feel a pressure of the outside world in the play, but the play is not about that pressure. It's about the characters inside this classroom. And so it was very important that it be represented as like characters that, and a situation that people could relate to, that it could be a classroom anywhere that was a TOEFL classroom globally, even though, of course, it wants to be specific to Iran, but it shouldn't be like, oh, it's like the roof is caving in because a bomb dropped. It was like totally opposite that. So that, really began that way. And I think with Canute and I, it really became an interesting question of like, well, how do you take that prompt and like begin to sort of investigate that? And how do you find these classrooms, and what constitutes beauty in those contexts? So I would say that in that instance, like we really work very hand in hand, like sharing a lot of images with each other, a lot of research. So it's not like a kind of situation of I get one prompt and then I design the set and then he comes over and it's done. It's very much like a kind of in-process discussion as we're developing it together.
I just wanted to bring up an image that I pulled of the set for English as we're doing this, because, well, one, I love staring at the images. They're so beautiful, but also it is sort of like the color, the sense of it, the straightness, the order to the space, just by you speaking about it in the way, knowing that the prompt was beautiful, it really makes even more sense now that I'm looking at it. Was this based on imagery you found?
It's sort of based on so many things. On one hand, something that became really influential to me was, I think just before I started working on this, I had gone to the Venice Architectural Biennial, and there was this display in the Belgian pavilion, and it was kind of detailed models of buildings that were larger than, they weren't like half-inch scale, maybe they were like 1-inch scale or something. And I was really intrigued by like this question of how much information do you need to give in order for space to be coherent. So that kind of became an aesthetic principle, and I like showed that to Canute, and he was really into it. So, for instance, like things like the windows, like, we know how complicated windows are, but it also, like, when I was looking at those Belgian architectures, it's just like a simple framing, and that's like all you needed. Part of what I was interested in doing with English was to see if I could kind of take one of these Belgian models and kind of blow it up with a level of detail. And so it became a kind of editing out of detail and only including, the details that were needed. But I mean, the actual research, like we were just looking at tons and tons of classrooms in Iran. I should also say when we first were working on this, we were working on it kind of during the pandemic. So it was like our first show for everyone since the pandemic. So we actually had, in a really beautiful way, a lot of time. So we would kind of all meet together. And Reza, where we had gaps, he would write his friends in Iran and be like, oh, can you send things? Or we would show him research that we had, and he'd be like, yeah, that was in my classroom. So we literally have an archive. I mean, I can't even fathom how many spaces we're looking in. And then it just became like, oh, like this, the whiteout board with the red frame, that was like in one image, and we became obsessed with that. And then, all of them had this raised platform for the teacher and this desk position. So, like it was kind of like extracting from, a bunch of different images to get to the image, the room that we in the end wanted to be making with it. And then, I mean, the curtains are so funny because I had the curtains made in Abu Dhabi. I always feel like curtains are like something that pulls the set and the costumes together. So because they were so inexpensive, I had them made in like 4 or 5 different colors, and I just brought them back. And we just kind of were auditioning the curtains during rehearsal in the rehearsal room. And then, because a lot of different colors were in our research. So anyway,
But it makes a lot of sense. I was staring both at the red outline, which pulls into focus the headscarf and the chair, right? That you're suddenly that red border leads you to notice the other 2 elements of red. And I was also noticing the little raised step, and I was wondering if that was, directly from research, because that's not a typical detail we see in our classrooms here, but it could be. It says the room speaks, just like you said, to classrooms everywhere.
I have another image of it, and I want to share that one too.
this was in the Atlantic, which is where we did it in, I guess it was the winter of 2022, actually. And it was, the first iteration of this project. And we really, I think the show has kind of been like this gift that keeps giving, because we had no idea that anything, would happen beyond this. And it was a really special show for everyone. And so we were just kind of feeling very grateful and complete from this process. So having it shift to Broadway was just kind of like, so special for all of us. And we were all, the entire cast and creative team were brought along, and that was really incredibly special.
So then it's changed. Obviously, because you've had to go into different spaces, but the one on Broadway, is it quite a bit bigger, or?
Yeah, it's much bigger. One of the things, too, that I try to do each time I do something is to be really insightful about the site. That I kind of will think about the theater as being a site. So in this instance at the Atlantic, the space has all these brick walls, and because it's a former church, there's also a kind of stained glass window. So one of the things that as part of our design process there was to put the whole set into a kind of void. And so I had noticed that the ceiling had this almost like a beadboard in the ceiling that was like a dark gray. So I basically just decided to replicate that on all three walls of the set. And it was also really important to us that the actors just kind of arrived without being seen, that they weren't kind of like, that they would just arrive inside the classroom, and then when they would leave, we wouldn't see them enter and leaving. And in Broadway, we're in a much bigger house, and we also have a very dramatic shift in the audience stage relationship, because in the first rows of the orchestra, they're below the stage level looking up, and then we also have a very, very steep balcony. So it's at the highest point, the sightline is really down. And so it was a very interesting question of like, how do we make this set work with the ceiling in a space like that? So I had to really kind of reconfigure the proportions. So it's much, much, much taller, actually. And then the box surrounding it is this black RP screen to make this kind of void around it, because it didn't make any sense to bring the context of the Atlantic Theater into the Broadway house. So now, it's funny because I save a lot of my rough models, and it's just so weird to see. I have this like stack of English models, and it's just like weird when I see the new proportions with the old proportions, because it felt at the time quite nicely proportioned to me, but now I'm like, oh, it's so squat, because my eye has adjusted to this more lofty proportion.
And even this one, when I look at it, it does feel like a model, like a little model. And I wonder if that changes once you lift that ceiling a little bit. It feels that way. I can't imagine. So how much more did you add to the height there?
Like a lot more. Like I can't remember offhand what it is, but I think it's at least 14 feet high, this ceiling, actually. If not, it could even be 16. So, and I was really terrified of that, because, it felt really nicely proportioned to me in the model box, like how the set sat in the theater. But I really was concerned in terms of like, would our focus still be on the actors with that height? But, there are a lot of rooms, like it's not so typical in the US, I would say, but like when you go abroad, or my experience entering a lot of spaces in Abu Dhabi, for example, or the UAE, is that there are a lot of spaces that have very tall ceilings, actually. It's less typical here. I think that the thing that's always great is that once you add light, that the light is the thing that is also helping to control your focus. So it didn't, in the end, at all feel out of proportion with the performers, which was great.
Yeah. Going back, I think that maybe that's where that's the layer within the storytelling that we do of, we present a lot of things on the visual level, but once the lighting comes in, really that's where the focus is pulled. They get to control that in so many ways. I'm always like, oh, I guess it didn't matter I added that thing, because the lights are never going to focus on that thing anyway.
Marsha, did you find when the proportions changed that you were pulling focus to the scenes in a different way, and that it impacted adjusting other elements?
I think there was definitely, again, like part of the thing that I really value is like when other designers come and sit and work with the model. So I think we discovered a lot because Reza would come and hang out, and we would just move lights around the model. And I think one of the things that is so stunning about the show is the way that Reza lit it, and that he really took advantage of, with this taller room, then you have a really, really tall window, actually. And that the ceiling very much becomes a canvas for a lot of the audience members because they're kind of looking up at it. And so it's almost like the most rigorous lesson of like, how can you use a window and light it like 100 different ways? Because that's what he did. And one of the things that was really beautiful is that one of his lights was on a winch. So it kind of moved up and down to almost mimic how the sun and the time of day gets determined by exterior to space and how the position of that light shifts the light in the room. So this kind of interaction of light and time became really central in this production. And these were ideas we obviously started in the Atlantic, but we were just able to realize them on an entirely different scale when we were on Broadway.
I'm curious about the difference between the production and tech schedule once you moved to a Broadway house. How long did you have in that prep time before opening?
I really feel so grateful for the Atlantic for kind of realizing this ambitious set that we brought to them and this idea that we have this rotating classroom, because one of the things that we all know is that when you have a larger budget, you can have a more, successfully functioning automation system. And so the fact that the Atlantic was on that budget able to realize it as well as they did was, really kind of remarkable. But at the same time, it, had its issues. So I think there were things that we could not really accomplish in terms of like one of the things that Canute was very interested in doing was to have like some internal shifts during a scene. And because of, sometimes the noise of the moving, it was often unreliable. He never felt like he could do that. So, you're moving into a situation of kind of working from a point of view of like having less money to having a similar design, but kind of amped up and different, but that's executed on another level. So I kind of got there on the 6th of December, and we started teching the week of Christmas, actually, between Christmas and New Year's was our tech. So, and then the other thing is that the entire exterior of the box is done by plasterers. And they also did some of the ceiling work to kind of fix seams, but it's all like a skim-coated plaster by people, these amazing Brazilian plasterers that work doing interiors throughout the city. So that also has its own time frame because we were basically there. It's like many cumbersome steps, and then they had to like sand it. So there, we had the time to do those kinds of things.
Do you request that, Marsha?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because we started working with them at the Atlantic because we had to do a lot of triage on the set because it was just like a bit of a mess. And I have this good friend who's in the building. He's a high-level contractor. And I was like, oh my God, the only way we can solve this is to have like people plaster it. So we called them in at the Atlantic, but it was like insane because we were already in tech. So they would come at like 11, work from like 11 to 4 in the morning or something like that. And then here, originally we were hoping that the painters could do this. And we had a really great paint shop that we hired. I kind of kept explaining, no, it has to be this thing. I'm not sure if it's something that scenic painters can do because I know this is like a building trade. And we kind of went down that path a little bit. And then it became clear that we really needed to, the production manager was like, I think you just want to have the Brazilian plasterers come. And I was like, yes. So, fortunately, we were able to, make that happen. But yeah, I guess it was like a 3.5 week load-in or something like that. Yeah.
Did it feel like you had more time or less time? Or was it just similar?
We had a lot of load-in time at the Atlantic, and maybe it was because I think we were like the first show after the pandemic, but I think that was like odd. And I guess I would say that this was more focused time because when we first did at the Atlantic, we were really discovering things. And also, one of the things that the Atlantic does to try to realize things is they send part of it to a shop and then take on a lot of projects themselves. And which allows you to have a bigger set because if everything goes to a shop, it's obviously unaffordable. So in a way, we probably had the same time, but at least in this situation, we had a very clear path of what we wanted and what was needed. But a lot of it is kind of like very time consuming work on this set. Like they're laying tiles basically. And the whole set has electricity in that wall behind the whiteboard. Like there's like the idea is that the whiteboard is removable so you can access electrical panels. So there's all, there's all kinds of like interfacing. Yeah, it's really complicated because it's a electrified room and it spins. So
Wow.
So it's a lot.
How are you feeling now that it's open and you're moving forward? How has it been?
Well, I mean, it's just been really joyous. The thing that's felt most significant really is to be part of this creative team and group of actors. And we sort of feel like and obviously like with Sanaz Toossi, who is just a really remarkable person. And the piece has just felt more resonant than ever before in this really, anti-immigrant moment. And interestingly, like she began the piece as a response to Trump beginning the Muslim ban when he was in office. So it's kind of a little bit strange to have it remounted in the beginning of this really the anti-immigrant stance of this administration. So there's been something that has just felt really purposeful about the content of the piece, but also just really joyous to get to create it again with this group of people. And to also, I think aesthetically, we didn't have a huge tech time, but, I think the precision with which Canute kind of moved forward on teching the show because we'd already done it was really magnificent and has kind of yielded another level of investigation into both the story but also the aesthetics of the show. So that's been amazing.
Can you give us an example? What does that mean?
Well, for one thing, like we end up using a pull down video screen instead of the little monitor that we had. And so that's really interesting in terms of how we can have a whole moment. There are a lot of these interstitial transitional moments that existed also at the Atlantic, but they're more fully integrated and I think a little bit longer here. So this notion of the piece taking place over like roughly 6 weeks, for example, and this question of like how do we indicate time passing is really done in these transitions. So there's like a beautiful transition where the two characters are like it's office hours and they watch these like, kind of English language romantic comedy videos. And so that's projected while the whole classroom is spinning around. And so it's really very beautiful to just have these moments of quiet, or I mean, it's things that I really like, and obviously Canute does too, but they are a kind of dramaturgy as well as the text.
yeah.
And so I think this incorporation of these transitional moments more fully into the piece has been very magical. And there's one point where the character whose name is Roya, who's kind of a bit at odds in that moment in the play with this question about English, she's a grandmother, and her grandson is in Canada. And so she plays a very beautiful scene, like it's the only scene outside of the classroom. And then Reza designed this beautiful sodium vapor light. So it's this kind of ethereal moment that she's not in the classroom, but she's in this, she's nowhere and everywhere at the same time. It feels like a very abstract, but also somehow very poignant moment in terms of, like, I don't know how to really describe it. So there are more moments like that, I think. I mean, they existed a bit, but that we were able to kind of amplify them visually and technically in this production.
And I like that about theater, that as it goes into a new space, it has to grow, and look at that growth as like ways of adding on to the investigation instead of impeding it is really nice. And it could maybe grow out to Los Angeles so we could see it.
I hope so. I mean, I shouldn't, there's a discussion right now. So, I mean, I hope that it happens actually, because I think there's a really large Persian community in Los Angeles. So it would be really great to have it there. So we'll see what happens. I think it's not a show that's designed to tour. And so the things that are kind of foundational to making it happen are quite ambitious in terms of the automation that's involved and that kind of thing. And I think that Canute feels like it's important that the show stays intact, that it's like all these elements are very much linked together. So we'll see what happens.
That's interesting. So Marsha, what is also pulling your focus right now? What else are you working on?
I'm doing another show with Canute that will be at Berkeley Rep, and it's by Yihei Park, called The Aves, and that's in, I think, May. And we're creating this giant pool, actually, that is like the whole thrust space and that has a walkway. And then I'm doing an opera with Christopher Alden that's at Opera Theater of St. Louis that I'm doing sets and costumes for, called Don Pasquale. And it's really crazy because it's their 50th anniversary, and he had done Don Pasquale their first year. So it's kind of like this anniversary celebration of that. And then I'm developing another new opera with Prototype about Hildegard von Bingen.
Who's Hildegard von Bingen?
She's a composer. I don't know if she's officially a saint, but she is kind of received some recognition from the church. She had visions, and she was like the first woman to be allowed to transcribe her visions. So there are writings of her visions, and so she was working with someone that would record them in language and also someone who recorded them in images. And she also composed, so like you could hear, like, her compositions are really, really incredible. And she also was involved in studies of nature and healing through plants. So she's really kind of interesting figure on many, many levels.
Where is that going to be?
It's actually going to start in LA at the Wallace with LA Opera, and then it'll be there in the fall, and then it will be at Prototype in the winter of 2026.
So you will be out here.
Yeah, so I'll be out there.
In terms of primary trust, which I know you had designed before, how do you feel with, it seems to be a number of productions out there that are being done of primary trust. Do you feel like there's relationships that you're finding to your original design?
Yeah, that's a tricky question to go on record with.
Yeah.
I guess the thing to say is that, like, one of the things when you're originating a new play and bringing it to life, to me, it's very important, this question of how do you kind of make the design feel like it's inevitable and that it is really linked with the play. And I think it's also been interesting with English because, for instance, like, I like invented this balcony space, this other space, because, if you have something rotating, you have to show all sides. And it's been interesting to hear that some productions, like the assistant director of English, he had directed a production at the Old Globe, and he was saying, like, someone was asking him about the balcony, and he was like, "There's no balcony in the script." So I sort of feel like that with Primary Trust a little bit, that it's a little bit of a tricky play because it's one of those plays that takes you to many different locations. And also I felt for myself that the town was also a character, like these types of I've spent a lot of time in these upstate towns that had other types of industry that left the town, and now the town kind of felt depleted. So for me, when I approached it, that was very important in the design. And so it is weird when you now see other productions, and like someone sent me a link for something in Maryland where they also did these facades of buildings, and that, I think that's kind of weird because we just like invented that as a way to do that, whereas it doesn't have to at all. Like, it's really wide open in terms of what the scenography of that piece can be, but maybe that's just kind of what happens. I'd like to believe like it's because we were successful in somehow linking the play to the environment that we created for it.
I do intrinsically think that that's the case, that when a work is successful, that it's because all of the elements are successful. I think that's important for us to recognize that we have such a big hand, especially as set designers, that must be the case, that we've not only in paths and movements, but in aesthetic and pulling focus to the right elements, or allowing a space to be able to pull that focus through the lighting and the costumes and other elements and performance. So
totally. I agree with that 100%, that it's kind of like, what's unique about this role as making spaces for performances is that on one hand, you want to make an interesting space, but it also shouldn't be like, I think it's this question of pulling focus, that it shouldn't be like that the space, I don't know, I don't want to say like the space shouldn't be more interesting. I think it's okay if the space is more interesting, but somehow the connection between everything has to feel really inevitable. Like that I always think that, you should see a show and you can't really imagine it could have been any other way. Like, that's always my kind of mantra about things.
I love that. Yeah.
Inevitably, I think that the thing about pulling focus that throws me when I get that as a note is that it feels like a distrust that I'm actually not along with the ride to get it in the right focus in some ways.
I think it's actually a note more about listening to the language, that actually by pulling focus, it's just not saying it in a way that is kind to the design team. It's more about, I can't listen to the language, you're pulling focus. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah. It's listening. We're visually looking at something to add a focus on top of the hearing, the auditory.
Well, the American
storytelling
is very connected to the language and the playwright. And, so it's nice to hear that Knud can play with the space to tell part of the story without the language as the transitions are happening or as time evolves. That's the thing that not everybody can do.
Yeah, I think this idea of when you talk about dramaturgy, that, and it's, connects to also how we teach too, is that this idea that dramaturgy is in the language or the interpretation of the language and the staging, but it's also, there's a visual dramaturgy about the whole thing as well. And so, I think that all of those things that's what kind of makes a successful production, is the linking of all of these dramaturgies together that are not disparate, but they're linked. So it's hard to know when someone says that the space is pulling focus, it's also maybe about aesthetics, because sometimes when I see shows and I feel like, like you see these hyper real sets and like, you see on the shelves like all these knickknacks and, yada yada. And I think that for me, that really pulls focus actually. And yet it's almost like that it's taken for granted that this is a kind of neutral environment because we should like replicate exactly what the, living room of a character and that, their idea of visual dramaturgy maybe in that methodology is that, we should have every last thing on the table. And I mean, I've done shows where that has been, talked about and stuff like that. So I think it becomes almost like an overarching question of aesthetics and like, where do you position yourself in terms of performance styles too?
And I think that you said something really interesting, which is calling it neutral, like these neutral environments, but there's really like they ask for them. They could be asked for, but there's no neutral environments. And especially like your environments, they trigger so much. They're not an in-between place necessarily. They're, I feel, landed in a other world. So I think that I'm now the phrase I'm going to sit on is neutral. Like what does that mean? So I'm glad that you've led me to another phrase that I will continue pondering for the next 2 weeks.
I really want to thank you for coming and talking with us. It's really interesting always to come back and talk to the designers that we started to converse with during making Scene Shift and then, with you in the Scene Shift exhibition. And so it felt really just important to us to check back in with you when we started the idea for the podcast.
And to congratulate you on your show.
Thank you. And I love that you guys are still doing this because, there's just such a paucity of information about the function of scenography in contemporary work. So, I mean, hats off to all of you for continuing all of these different initiatives. I really feel grateful that I've been able to be part of them.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.